I'm a researcher by training. My bias is towards data. I find comfort in a cold statistic. My freshman year of college in Seattle, I interned for an environmental justice organization, determined to apply my newly honed skills in quantitative analysis to a movement that rightfully questioned the validity of such an approach. The organization championed the voices and the leadership of people of color in the purpose of community participatory research. This is all for the pursuit of a healthy environment for all. At a conference the organization held, there was a session on gentrification led by Black residents of a public housing development. To kick off the session, there was a disclaimer. In this session, we will not use any data, we will not discuss statistics. Instead, we will chart the changes in the community based on the testimony of its residents in their own words. As I nodded my head and snapped my fingers, I really didn't understand what that meant. As a 14-year-old girl, described the depression that overcame her family because they lived in a crumbling building and didn't know where they could go next. I murmured my sympathies, but I still didn't get what that meant. As an elder, her hair wrapped, with a distant look in her eyes, recounted seeing too many funerals of youth. I cried, but I still didn't get what that meant. After the session, my colleagues passed around feedback cards and asked all of us on staff to fill them out. I filled mine out, put it in the basket. The next day at work, I sat at the computer, entering the feedback as my colleague Mel read from the cards. Who is this asshole? Did they not understand the point of this session? They wrote, the residents described how they felt, but didn't provide any evidence. Numbers and percentages might have been useful. Can you believe that? I froze. The blood drained from my face because Mel was reading from my card. I was so embarrassed, but I couldn't tell why for years. Because for so long, I had internalized the idea that there is such a thing as objectivity, that there is such a thing as a meritocracy, that there is such a thing as all things being equal. I needed these things to be true. I strived to achieve these things. Because how else could I live in a world in which cruelty, poverty, sexism, and racism were woven like a fabric into the everyday, fashioned into a noose around people who look like me, while I was out here breathing? I couldn't risk the feeling. My mother is Japanese. My father is Black. My mother, always the rebel, left Buddhism for Christianity and married my father, the first Black person she ever met. My father, he was born in a shanty town in Texas in the 1960s, but he grew up in San Francisco, where his classmates refused to drink from the same water fountain that he did because he nigger-lipped it. They raised me and my brother in the suburbs of Sacramento. We grew up in a house where we drank milk from cows that grazed across the street. And then we moved to another house with too many bedrooms and an adjustable rate mortgage that burst in the bubble of 2008. My brother, the track star, always popular, record-breaking. But me, I was the striver. That striving got me through college on a full scholarship. That striving got me to policy, where I learned that the world's greatest problems could be solved by code switching. That striving got me to the White House, where I got to serve under a president that looked like me. He gives great hugs, by the way. But Michelle's are better. That striving got me to grad school at Oxford, where my classmates would say to me, "But you're not that black," and mean it as a compliment. That striving got me to Google. That striving made me an exception to the rules. When I joined Google, I just felt happy to be there. My background's environmental policy, and this tech company wants me? What? We've all read the stats on diversity in tech, so I felt like I was just happy to be there. And I thought that perhaps it would be too much to both be there and be myself. So even though a company motto is bring your whole self to work, I left most of myself at home. Until one day, I couldn't just be there anymore. It was the summer of 2016, and Black people across the country were being killed on video by white people who swore they were there to protect them. In the wake of the killings of Alton Sterling and Philando Castile by police, Google declared on Twitter, #BlackLivesMatter, while in our offices, we had conversations about whether that was actually true. We get too many emails, so I missed the memo that said the next Black Google Network meeting, a safe space for colleagues of color like myself, would be open to the entire office to discuss what this deadly summer had to do with us. I burst into the room unaware. Tear-streaked faces turned my way, mostly white. I meekly made my way to an open seat, sat down and listened. I told myself I wouldn't say anything. I'm just happy to be here. But after Black mothers voiced the silent fears they harbor for their Black sons, and after men of color cried, recounting the familiar indignity of being called boy, the white people in the room started to speak. They admitted they had no Black friends growing up. They grew up in all-white neighborhoods, but not on purpose. That, come to think of it, they didn't have Black neighbors now, but not on purpose. They stammered, "I didn't realize racism was so bad, and I just don't know what to do about it." They reasoned, "It's really hard for me to reconcile what I see on the news with the people of color I know in my life and at work. These issues don't seem to affect you directly because we're so privileged here." I told myself I wasn't going to say anything, but the pit in my stomach grew deeper as these comments went on. And as the pit grew deeper, a fire rose through my chest and raged against my lips. I took a deep breath and unleashed. First of all, it is extremely insulting to ask us if this is real and if we are affected. How should we prove this to you? By recounting every racist thing that's ever happened in our lives? It is extremely insulting for you to ask us to recount and relive our trauma, which will certainly exhaust and trigger us, just to give you the option, white people, of evaluating the evidence, especially since you're the cause of all this trauma. And this excuse about not knowing that racism existed because you grew up in white neighborhoods, that was a racist decision your parents made. Have you read the history of redlining? And I paused. I calculated the risk in telling my own story. Because once this story leaves your mouth, it is no longer yours. But in this moment, I felt like I had no choice but to tell it. No amount of education, of code switching, of money changes the fact of my blackness. When my brother was brutalized by police while sitting on a street corner, blacked out and wounded from a knife, they didn't see that he was a Division I athlete that went to a top university who earned a merit scholarship. They didn't see the child that grew up in a gated community in the suburbs. They saw his blackness, and they responded accordingly. How do I know this? I read it in the police report. Black male in a wife beater, menacing look. My brother, all of 5'9", with long eyelashes that I will forever envy, and chipmunk cheeks. Black male in a wife beater, menacing look. I will never, ever forget the phone call from the police that my brother was unconscious and handcuffed to a hospital bed, that I was his only call, requested while he slept, that he didn't want to tell our parents, that he didn't know what happened and didn't think he did anything wrong, but he's lying here in this hospital bed. He has a broken nose, he's been stabbed, he has bruised ribs, and somehow, at some point, the police got him to apologize. This was the moment I realized, after all of my striving, we were really just like every other Black person. We were a statistic. The rules were in place. I couldn't help but finish with this. I hate that I had to tell you this story, because now all I can do is hope that you will get why this matters. And that is the definition of your white privilege. I left that meeting, t-shirt soaked with tears, thinking, that's it. There goes my carefully crafted persona. Maybe I'll get fired. Instead of getting fired, my director asked me to come up with as many programs as I could addressing inequality in tech. Because as an Asian man growing up in the Midwest, he too knew the feeling of the fire in his belly rising through his chest. 2 years, 13 programs, and one nonprofit later, thousands of women of color in DC are gaining the access and resources they need to succeed as entrepreneurs. DC's high school students get to learn about robotics and compete in national competitions. And Black and brown law school students get to work at firms that wouldn't give them a first glance. And I get to ask them, what's your story? I get to tell them, you matter. And it's all because I took the risk of sharing my story and showing people who I truly am. I never expected to become a leader by sharing one of the most traumatic moments of my life. But emotional vulnerability, it's an invitation. It is the opening of a revelation. And it is the first step in a revolution. I could tell you that studies show that emotional vulnerability is an asset to leadership. It is productive. It is profitable. I could quote statistics like the top 10 companies in the Global Empathy Index increased in value more than twice as much than the bottom 10% and generated 50% more earnings. But that doesn't matter. I share my story, not because that is the way you advance your career at Google, but because I believe all of us have the responsibility to solve the world's most pressing and deep-rooted problems. How do we dismantle racism? The solution seems large, looming just out of reach. And why? Because we rely on a narrative, a singular narrative, of salvation that displaces responsibility from those with the privilege to not be affected to those who can't help but be. No, we all have a sacrifice to make. And white people, it's your turn to make it. Everyone has a story, an experience that pierces the veil of fairness and security that society places over us to maintain the status quo. And at the edges of our stories, the veil tatters, it shrinks. Eventually, it unravels. But too many of us cling to that veil in exchange for our silence. I did. But it isn't until we let go of that comforting cloth that we can see the world for what it truly is and believe that a new one is possible. Things will not get better unless we get honest. The stakes are too high to mask this as anything less than, how do we save the world? In the fight for your life, who do you want by your side? I want the person who opened their mouth when the fire in their belly rose through their chest and raged against their lips. I want the person who affirms me by saying, "Thank you for telling your story. Now let me tell you mine."